The rain pounded against the windows of the two-story colonial house in Hartford, Connecticut, with such force it seemed like the glass might shatter. A November storm that felt endless. Gray skies pressing down on the quiet suburban street where families usually decorated their porches with pumpkins and Thanksgiving wreaths. Margaret Collins, 72 years old, stood frozen in the hallway clutching the small suitcase her son had allowed her to pack, the one she had managed to fill with only a few items while her hands trembled too much to fold clothes properly. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom," said David Collins, her only child, his voice flat, cold in a way Margaret had never heard before, a tone so sharp it carved into her chest like a blade. "You've become a burden we just can't keep carrying." A burden, he had called her? Her, the woman who had raised him after her husband Tom died when David was only 12, who had worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to keep a roof over their heads, who had sacrificed nights of sleep to sit at his bedside when fevers racked his small body. Margaret stared at him as though he were a stranger. Standing just behind him was his wife, Stephanie, arms folded, face a mask of icy resolve. Stephanie had once called her Mom with such warmth, but now her lips curved in a faint sneer, her eyes void of kindness. "David, please," Margaret whispered, her voice shaking with fear and humiliation. "At least wait until morning. Look outside, it's dangerous. Where am I supposed to go in this storm?" But Stephanie interjected sharply. "We've waited long enough. 3 months of your prescriptions, your doctor visits, your complaints about the food, about the noise, about the kids. We've done more than enough. It ends tonight." Margaret's gaze darted toward the staircase, hoping to catch a glimpse of her grandchildren. Twin girls she had cradled from birth, children she had sung to sleep, who used to curl into her lap for bedtime stories. But they weren't there. No goodbyes. No explanations. It was as if she were being erased from their lives. David opened the front door, and the roar of the rain and wind surged into the house. Without another word, he yanked the suitcase from her grip and hurled it onto the soaked driveway. The case popped open, spilling out what little she had packed, a framed photo of David in his cap and gown the day he graduated law school, the rosary beads her mother had given her, a few old letters tied with faded ribbon. Margaret gasped. "David, what are you doing?" she pleaded, moving toward the door, but he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "I found you a spot at the city shelter," he said curtly. "It's 20 minutes on foot. They'll take care of you there. Here." He shoved a small envelope into her hands. Inside were $200 in cash. $200 in exchange for 47 years of sacrifice, for the countless nights she had scrubbed offices until dawn just to buy his school books, for the jewelry she pawned to cover his tuition at NYU Law, for the dignity she lost working shifts at diners when she should have been enjoying her later years. "My son," she began. But before she could finish, the heavy oak door slammed shut in her face. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot that ended everything she had believed about family. For a moment she stood motionless, rain soaking through her gray hair, running down her face, mingling with the tears she no longer felt capable of shedding. Slowly, she bent to gather her scattered belongings, her fingers stiff and numb as she stuffed them back into the case. She zipped it shut and lifted it with trembling arms, the weight dragging at her shoulders as much as the betrayal pressing on her heart. She had nowhere to go. The shelter, she knew, would already be full. She had seen the news reports, rows of cots, elderly men and women turned away into the night because the economic downturn that left too many people without homes. What chance did she have? Still, she began to walk, the rain soaking her coat until it clung heavy against her body, her shoes squelching with every step. With each block, memories flashed unbidden, holding David for the first time in the sterile hospital room, his tiny fingers curling around hers, cheering as he took his first steps across their kitchen floor, studying with him late into the night at the wobbly dining table, watching him smile proudly as Tom snapped photos before illness took him too soon. Years of exhaustion, sacrifice, joy, sorrow, all carried in her heart, all dismissed tonight as if they meant nothing. By the time she reached the old river bridge downtown, her body shook from the cold. Normally, the bridge gleamed with decorative lights in flower boxes planted by the City Beautification Committee, but tonight it looked like a skeleton against the storm, stripped and bleak. Margaret found a narrow path down to the underside of the bridge, where the concrete arch gave a little shelter from the rain. She set down her suitcase and lowered herself onto it, shivering violently as water dripped steadily from cracks overhead. This was her first night as a homeless woman, at 72, after a lifetime of giving everything she had to her son. She did not cry. The tears had dried somewhere between the slammed door and the bitter wind cutting through her coat. Instead, she stared out at the reflection of the city lights in the swollen Connecticut River and wondered how she would survive tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that. Morning came cruelly bright. The storm gone, the sky sharp and clear. Margaret's joints screamed as she tried to stand, her body stiff from cold and damp. Every sound startled her. The rumble of a passing truck, the bark of a dog, the chatter of a group of teenagers heading home from a late party. She clutched her suitcase tighter and tried to push down the rising panic. She had to find food, warmth, something. She walked until she found a small diner near Main Street, a neon sign buzzing faintly above the door. With shaking hands, she pulled a 20 from her envelope, ordered the cheapest breakfast, black coffee and a single slice of toast, and ate slowly, trying to stretch the moment, to pretend for a few minutes that she was just another customer on a Saturday morning. Around her, families laughed, couples shared pancakes, a group of retirees in baseball caps swapped stories at the counter. She felt invisible, like a ghost haunting a world that had moved on without her. When she finally forced herself back onto the street, she headed for the bank where she had kept her small savings, the last piece of security she believed she had left. It wasn't much, just over $3,000 she had scraped together from years of pinching pennies, but it could keep her afloat until she figured out her next step. She waited in line, her clothes still damp, her hair frizzing in every direction, until a young teller with a polished smile called her forward. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Margaret said, sliding her ID across the counter. The teller typed for a few moments, her expression changing, tightening. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins, but this account was emptied 3 days ago." Margaret blinked, uncomprehending. "Emptied? No, I didn't withdraw anything." The teller turned the screen slightly, pointing at the record. "It shows here the transaction was made by your son, David Collins. He had signed authorization." Margaret's stomach dropped as the world tilted. "Authorization?" She shook her head violently. "I never gave him that. I never—" Her mind flashed back to papers David had asked her to sign months ago, telling her they were from medical forms, insurance paperwork, to simplify her care. She had signed without reading, trusting her son. The teller's polite, pitying gaze was the final humiliation. Margaret staggered out of the bank, clutching her empty wallet, realizing as she had been robbed not only of her home, but of the last of her savings. The betrayal was total. Margaret drifted back to the shelter of the bridge that evening, her body aching with exhaustion, her mind foggy from shock and hunger. Clutching the empty envelope that once held her meager safety net and now only represented betrayal, she set down her suitcase again, but this time she wasn't alone. An older woman, perhaps mid-60s, sat on a folded blanket nearby, her wiry gray hair tucked beneath a knit cap, her eyes sharp but not unkind, and when she noticed Margaret, she offered half of a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "First time out here?" she asked bluntly, her voice raspy with years of cigarettes or cold nights. And Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. "I'm Lillian," the woman continued, extending a surprisingly firm hand. "Been out here 6 months since my kids decided I was too much trouble to keep around." And though the words were delivered with a bitter edge, there was an underlying current of resilience. Margaret introduced herself quietly, explaining little, but Lillian seemed to understand without details. "They don't want us when we're no longer convenient," she said. "But we find each other." And that night, the two women huddled under the arch, sharing body heat against the creeping chill, sharing fragments of their stories. Margaret admitted how her son David and his wife had pushed her out, how she had raised him alone after losing her husband, how she had believed loyalty meant security. And Lillian told her how her own daughter had grown tired of caring for a woman with arthritis and diabetes, how the daughter's new husband had insisted they needed their space, how she had been left with a bag of clothes and a bus ticket to nowhere. As they spoke, Margaret felt less alone, though shame still burned deep. The following morning, Lillian guided her to a soup kitchen on the south side, a church basement filled with folding tables, where volunteers ladled out bowls of chili, handing out cornbread and black coffee without judgment. And Margaret, trembling with gratitude, ate slowly, her body finally warming with each spoonful of food. But her cough had worsened overnight, a deep rattling in her chest that left her breathless. And Lillian frowned, pressing a hand against her shoulder. "You need a doctor, lady. That's pneumonia if I've ever heard it," she insisted, suggesting a free clinic that treated the homeless. Margaret resisted at first, too ashamed to admit how quickly she was unraveling. But later that afternoon, when she nearly collapsed climbing the stairs of the public library where she had gone to get warm, she scribbled her sister's number on a scrap of paper and pressed it into Lillian's hand, whispering, "If I don't wake up tomorrow, call her. Her name is Susan. She lives in Boston," before she slipped into a restless, feverish sleep. She awoke sometime later to the sensation of someone gripping her hand, and when her blurry vision cleared, she saw a face she hadn't expected to ever see again. Susan Bennett, her younger sister, immaculate as always in a wool coat and scarf, eyes wide with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Maggie, my God!" Susan said, kneeling beside her. "What has he done to you?" Margaret struggled to sit up, her voice hoarse. How did you find me?" And Susan explained in clipped sentences that Lillian had called 2 days earlier, that she had searched every shelter and ER in the city until she finally found Margaret beneath this bridge, that she had driven down from Boston without sleeping because the thought of her older sister alone in the cold was unbearable. With Susan came blankets, bottled water, a thermos of hot tea, and within hours, she had bundled Margaret into her car, a sleek silver SUV, and was driving her to the hospital, ignoring Margaret's weak protests. At Hartford General, the ER doctor diagnosed pneumonia, compounded by hypertension and malnutrition, warning bluntly that another night outside could have been fatal. She was admitted, hooked up to IV antibiotics and fluids, drifting in and out of consciousness as Susan sat vigil at her bedside, handling paperwork, speaking with doctors, making calls with the efficient authority of a woman used to running things. After all, Susan had been a powerhouse attorney in Boston before retiring 2 years ago, though Margaret had kept her distance, too ashamed of her struggles to reach out. Over the next 5 days, Susan never left, except to shower or answer urgent calls. And Margaret began to see her sister in a new light. Not just the ambitious career woman she had envied, but a steadfast presence who refused to let her slip away. One evening, when Margaret's fever had broken and she could speak again, she murmured, "I should have called you months ago." And Susan squeezed her hand. "And I should have called you more often, too, Maggie. We let pride get between us. That ends now." When Margaret was discharged, weak but recovering, Susan drove her straight to her spacious condo in Boston's Back Bay, a high-ceilinged apartment filled with sunlight, hardwood floors gleaming, shelves lined with books, and framed photographs of travels and old colleagues. "You'll stay here," Susan said firmly, showing her the guest room already stocked with fresh linens and new clothes. Margaret protested, mumbling about being a burden again, but Susan cut her off sharply. "You took care of me after Mom died. You practically raised me, Maggie. Now it's my turn. You're not a burden. You're my sister." Over the next weeks, as Margaret slowly regained her strength, Susan took her to top specialists for her blood pressure and arthritis, bought her warm coats and sensible shoes, and encouraged her to attend community classes to rebuild confidence. Margaret insisted on helping with chores, cooking dinners in gratitude, making Susan's condo smell of roast chicken and apple pie. For the first time in years, she felt herself again. But shadows lingered. She could not stop thinking of David and the betrayal that had left her shivering under a bridge, the way he had stripped her of her savings with forged signatures, the way that Stephanie had watched it all with cold satisfaction. And as Margaret stared out at the Boston skyline one snowy evening, sipping tea in Susan's living room, she whispered to herself that she was done being powerless, that she would never again allow her son to hold her life in his hands. Margaret settled uneasily into Susan's Back Bay condo, a place so beautiful it almost embarrassed her to walk across the polished hardwood floors, as if her worn shoes and weathered hands might stain the perfection of the space. Yet Susan made it clear daily that this was her home now, urging her to relax, to focus on healing, to accept that family was supposed to be a refuge, not a battlefield. And while Margaret cooked dinners and folded laundry to feel useful, she carried a gnawing anxiety about what came next. For she knew David and Stephanie had not only abandoned her, but had stolen the last of her savings with forged documents, a crime wrapped in legal language that left her feeling vulnerable and foolish. One crisp January morning, Susan invited her to sit on the balcony, the winter sun glinting off the Charles River, and placed a folder on the table between them. "I've been thinking a lot about your future, Maggie," she began, her lawyer's tone softened by sisterly concern. "And what David did wasn't just cruel. It might have been illegal. You don't need to press charges if you don't want to, but we do need to make sure you're protected going forward." Margaret shook her head, whispering, "I can't drag my son into court, Susan. He's still my boy. I just want to be safe." Susan nodded slowly. "Then we'll do exactly that. We'll secure your independence so no one, not even David, can manipulate you again." And with that, she revealed she had purchased a modest but elegant condo for Margaret in Cambridge, close enough for daily visits, but separate enough to give her space. Fully in her name, mortgage-free, equipped with safety rails and modern appliances. Margaret's breath caught as she flipped through photos of bright rooms and a small balcony overlooking a quiet park. "Susan, this is too much," she stammered. But her sister was firm. "It's already done. You gave everything to David. Let me give this to you. Besides, I made more money in my career than I could ever spend, and I'd rather see it secure you now than sit in some trust fund for strangers after I'm gone." Tears blurred Margaret's eyes as she realized she had gone from sleeping under a bridge to owning a new home in less than 2 months. Her life rescued not by her son, but by the sister she had once distanced herself from out of pride. Yet Susan had more in mind. She arranged for Margaret to meet with a lawyer friend, Angela Price, a specialist in elder rights, who explained gently but firmly that what David had done was a form of financial abuse, that forged signatures could be challenged, and that Margaret should set up new legal protections: an updated will, a power of attorney that rested with someone she trusted, advance directives that shielded her from exploitation. Margaret felt ashamed as she confessed she had signed whatever David put in front of her without reading, but Angela reassured her. "You're far from alone. I see this every day. The good news is you're here now, and we can lock everything down tight." With Susan's encouragement, Margaret agreed, and over the following weeks, she opened new bank accounts, cut off all ties to the old ones David had accessed, and signed papers that gave her full autonomy with Susan as backup only if she requested. Slowly, she felt the fog of helplessness lift, replaced by a sense of control she hadn't felt since her husband was alive. Meanwhile, Susan encouraged her to reconnect with her identity beyond motherhood. Margaret had been a beloved English teacher in Hartford for 30 years, and Susan suggested she join a community reading group at the Cambridge Senior Center. Nervous, Margaret attended her first session, only to be greeted warmly by a dozen retirees eager to discuss a novel she had taught decades earlier. And when she offered her insights, heads nodded, voices praised her analysis, and for the first time in years, she felt like more than a discarded caretaker. She felt like herself again. Afterward, the group's organizer invited her to lead a workshop. "We could use someone with your background." And though Margaret demurred, Susan urged her to say yes. Teaching is who you are, Maggie. Don't let David steal that, too. That night, Margaret stood at her new kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for soup, reflecting on the impossible journey from the cold stone under the river bridge to this bright condo, from being called a burden to rediscovering purpose. And she whispered aloud, "I'm not finished yet," surprising herself with the strength in her voice. But just as she began to believe in her new beginning, the past entreated. An unmarked envelope slid under her new door one afternoon, containing nothing but a handwritten note. "We need to talk. The kids miss you. Please call us. David." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the familiar script, torn between longing for her grandchildren and dread of more manipulation. And when Susan saw the note that evening, her jaw tightened. "He knows where you live. This isn't over, Maggie. He's testing your boundaries." Margaret folded the note carefully, set it aside, and for the first time in her life said aloud words she had never dared. "Then let him test me. I'm not afraid anymore." The knock came 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning, sharp and insistent, echoing through the quiet Cambridge condo as Margaret was brewing coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. And when she opened the door, her breath caught. There stood David, his hair damp from the drizzle outside, dressed in his tailored suit as if arriving from court, Stephanie just behind him with her designer handbag slung over her arm, her lips pressed in the same disdainful line Margaret remembered from that night in Hartford. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, his voice carrying the authority of an attorney used to being obeyed. But Margaret, though her heart raced, held her ground, blocking the doorway with her small frame. "You've made it clear I'm no longer welcome in your life, David. What could you possibly have left to say?" He sighed dramatically, glancing back at Stephanie, then softened his tone. "The girls, they miss you. They've been asking about their grandmother, why you're not around anymore. They don't understand, and it's tearing them up." The words twisted like a knife. Margaret's chest ached with longing for her granddaughters, the little girls who used to braid her hair and giggle over bedtime stories. But before she could respond, Stephanie chimed in smoothly. "It's cruel to keep them from her, David. Maybe if she hadn't stormed out that night." Margaret's jaw clenched. She remembered every detail of being shoved into the storm, suitcase thrown onto the driveway, called a burden. "Stormed out?" she repeated, voice shaking with indignation. "You threw me out like trash." David raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, mistakes were made, but let's move forward. Families should stick together. We'd like you to come by for dinner next week." Margaret felt the trap instantly. The offer dangled with promises of reconnection, yet underneath she sensed the same manipulation that had emptied her bank account. She straightened her shoulders and replied, "If my granddaughters want to see me, I'll gladly welcome them here, in my home, but I will not step foot in yours again." Stephanie's eyes narrowed. "This place? How did you even afford it, Margaret? On your pension?" The insinuation dripped with venom, and Margaret realized they had already begun probing, searching for leverage. David shifted uneasily. "Look, Mom, I think we got off on the wrong foot, but maybe we can clear up some financial misunderstandings about your accounts, about that paperwork." Margaret cut him off, voice steady now. "Those misunderstandings nearly killed me, David. I know what you did. You stole from me. You betrayed every ounce of trust I had left, and you'll never touch another penny of mine again." His face hardened, the charming facade cracking. "Careful, Mom. Accusations like that could ruin reputations." Behind him, Stephanie's smirk returned, cruel and thin, as if she enjoyed watching mother and son square off. Margaret, though trembling inside, forced herself to meet his eyes. "My reputation is all I have left, and I'll fight to protect it. You may be a lawyer, but I've got something stronger than your threats. I've got the truth." For a long moment, the three stood in tense silence, rain dripping steadily from the eaves, and then Susan's voice rang out from the hallway. "Is there a problem here?" She strode forward in her tailored blazer, her presence commanding, her eyes locked on David like a predator spotting prey. I suggest you two leave before I call building security. This condo is private property. David bristled, but Stephanie tugged at his sleeve, sensing the balance had shifted. And with a final glare, he muttered, "This isn't over, Mom," before turning on his heel and stalking down the hall, Stephanie clicking after him in her heels. Margaret's knees weakened the moment the door shut, and she collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest, whispering, "I don't know how much more I can take." Susan crouched beside her, gripping her hand. "You've already taken more than anyone should, Maggie. But you're stronger now, and we're going to make sure they can never hurt you again." That evening, Angela Price, the elder law attorney, came by at Susan's request, and Margaret poured out the entire confrontation. Every detail of David's manipulation, every lingering fear about losing her granddaughters. Angela listened intently, then laid it out plainly. You have to decide what matters most: contact with the girls or complete severance from David and Stephanie. Right now, they're using your love for those children as leverage. If you let them in even a little, they'll exploit that weakness. But if you stand firm, you protect yourself. Sometimes self-preservation means heartbreak. Margaret wept quietly, torn between the ache of grandmotherly love and the fire of self-respect. And at last she whispered, "I won't let them destroy me again. If my granddaughters love me, one day they'll find their way back. Until then, I'll endure." Angela nodded approvingly. "Then we'll proceed with securing your estate, your accounts, everything airtight. And if they try anything, we'll be ready." Over the following weeks, Margaret noticed subtle signs. Strange phone calls late at night, envelopes slid under her door with veiled threats, even a man in a car parked too long outside her building. And though fear gnawed at her, she refused to bend. With Susan and Angela beside her, she began drafting not just protective documents, but a plan for something larger, something that would reclaim her dignity and ensure her suffering had meaning. If David could betray his own mother like that, then I can only imagine how many other women are going through the same thing, alone, ashamed, powerless. I don't want to just survive this, Susan. I want to fight back, not just for me, but for them. Susan's eyes lit with approval. "Then let's build something together, Maggie. Let's make sure no one else ends up under a bridge because their family betrayed them." And for the first time in months, Margaret felt not only safe, but purposeful. The idea for the foundation began almost as a whisper between sisters at Susan's dining table, but within weeks it had taken on a life of its own, fueled by Margaret's determination and Susan's resources. They named it the Second Wind Fund, dedicated to helping women over 65 who had suffered financial or emotional abuse at the hands of their own families. And Margaret threw herself into it with a fervor that surprised even her, spending long hours in Susan's office poring over research, drafting mission statements, and meeting with Angela Price to structure it legally so every penny was protected from predators like David. And though she often grew tired, her spirit was relentless. "If I can pull even one woman off the street and give her the chance Susan gave me, then it will all be worth it," she said, her eyes shining with the fire of purpose. Susan leveraged her network of retired attorneys and nonprofit executives, arranging meetings with potential donors, while Margaret brought the emotional gravitas, standing in small community halls or senior centers, telling her story not as a victim, but as a survivor, her voice trembling with authenticity that moved audiences to tears. Soon, donations began to trickle in. $50 from a church group in Dorchester, $200 from a retired nurse in Newton, $1,000 from a local women's club. And though the amounts were modest, each felt like a validation that Margaret's pain was transforming into hope for others. But as the Second Wind Fund grew, so too did David's shadow. He began calling Margaret's new phone, leaving voicemails laced with a toxic blend of guilt and anger. "Mom, the girls cry for you every night. How can you abandon them like this? After everything I've done for you, you're poisoning them against me. Stop this madness before it goes too far." Margaret deleted them, though each one left her trembling. And Angela warned, "This is classic manipulation, using the grandchildren as bait. Stay focused." Stephanie, meanwhile, launched a subtler attack, spreading rumors among mutual acquaintances back in Hartford that Margaret had lost her mind, that she was unstable, that Susan had swooped in to control her finances for her own gain. Former neighbors began calling with awkward questions, their words tinged with doubt, and Margaret realized with a sick twist in her stomach that her own reputation was being weaponized. Susan urged her to ignore it, but Margaret knew silence could be dangerous, so she agreed to give a televised interview on a local Boston channel about elder financial abuse. Her story broadcast into thousands of homes where she spoke clearly. I was left in the cold with nothing but a suitcase because I trusted the wrong people. But I stand here today alive and stronger because someone else believed in me. I want other women to know they are not alone. The response was overwhelming. The Foundation's hotline received dozens of calls that very night, women confessing stories eerily similar, some sobbing, some angry, some simply relieved to be heard. Yet even as Margaret's resolve strengthened, David's aggression escalated. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail stamped with the letterhead of his law firm, demanding that Margaret cease defamatory actions against him and Stephanie, threatening a defamation lawsuit if she continued speaking publicly. Margaret's hands shook as she read the legal jargon, the fear of court battles pressing against her chest. But when she showed it to Susan and Angela, both laughed coldly. This is intimidation, Maggie, nothing more. He knows the truth would destroy him if it ever reached discovery. We'll respond formally, and that will be the end of it. Margaret exhaled in relief, though her nights remained restless, haunted by the memory of David as a little boy, innocent and trusting, long before ambition and Stephanie's influence hardened him. One evening, while reviewing foundation plans, Susan asked softly, "Do you still love him, Maggie?" And Margaret, after a long silence, whispered, "I love the child he was. I don't know the man he's become." By spring, the Second Wind Fund had secured enough funding to open a small transitional housing unit in Somerville. 6 beds, a common kitchen, a cozy reading room stocked with donated books, and Margaret stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony surrounded by volunteers, reporters, and the first women who would move in, her heart swelling as she cut the ribbon with trembling hands, declaring, "This house belongs to every woman who has ever been told she is a burden. Here you are valued. Here you begin again." Applause thundered, and for the first time since that stormy night in Hartford, Margaret felt not only safe, but triumphant. Still, the shadow of her son lingered, and deep down she knew a confrontation loomed, that David would not allow her newfound strength to exist without challenge, and that one day soon she would have to face him not as his mother, but as a woman who had reclaimed her power. The confrontation came sooner than Margaret expected, in the form of a summons delivered by a sheriff's deputy to her Cambridge condo one humid afternoon in June. The heavy paper declaring that David Collins, her only son, was suing her for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming her interviews and public speeches had damaged his professional reputation as an attorney. Margaret sat at the kitchen table staring at the document until her hands went numb, whispering, "He's really going to drag me into court?" And when Susan came home from a meeting and saw her pale face, she skimmed the papers quickly before tossing them aside with a scoff. "This is desperation, Maggie. Empty theater. He knows he's guilty and wants to silence you before more people listen." But Margaret trembled, imagining sitting in a courtroom with David across from her, forced to speak against her own child. Yet Angela Price assured her they had nothing to fear. "Truth is your defense, and you have witnesses, documents, even bank records. If he pushes this, he'll bury himself." Still, Margaret dreaded the spectacle, the whispers, the humiliation, until one unexpected discovery shifted everything. The hospital where she had been treated for pneumonia in Hartford still had the intake notes from that night, including her report that she had been evicted and left without shelter by her son and daughter-in-law, evidence recorded before she had any reason to exaggerate. Angela obtained the records legally, attaching them to a countersuit for financial exploitation and fraud, a bold move that stunned Margaret, though she reluctantly agreed. If I stay silent, he'll only do it again. Maybe not to me, but to someone else. The months leading up to the hearing were tense. Letters from David's attorneys arrived weekly, full of threats and demands. Reporters began sniffing around the story after whispers of a mother versus son courtroom drama, and Margaret's foundation donors worried about bad press. But Susan stood firm, rallying supporters, reminding her sister daily, this isn't just about you. This is about every woman who's been silenced by fear. When the court date finally arrived, Margaret walked into the Middlesex County Courthouse in a simple navy dress, her silver hair neatly pinned, Susan and Angela flanking her like sentinels. The hall buzzed with curiosity, reporters scribbling notes, onlookers craning to see the elderly woman at the center of such a scandal. David stood at the opposite table in a sleek charcoal suit, his expression a mask of righteous indignation. Stephanie beside him in pearls and a tailored jacket, her smile tight and brittle. As proceedings began, his attorney painted Margaret as a confused, bitter old woman manipulated by her wealthy sister into fabricating stories, arguing she had damaged David's career with baseless accusations. Margaret's stomach nodded as the words echoed through the courtroom. But when Angela rose to present their case, she spoke with calm authority, laying out the timeline of Margaret's eviction, the bank records showing withdrawals authorized by David, the hospital intake notes, even testimony from Lillian, the homeless woman who had shared a blanket with Margaret under the bridge, who recounted in harrowing detail finding her shivering and penniless. Gasps rippled through the room as the narrative shifted. Margaret was no longer a bitter old woman, but a survivor of cruelty at the hands of her own son. When Margaret herself took the stand, her voice shook at first, but as she described the stormy night in Hartford, the slam of the door, the envelope of cash thrust into her hands, the suitcase spilling onto the driveway, her words gained strength. Tears streaming down her face as she declared, I gave him everything I had and he left me to die in the rain. I am not here to destroy him. I am here to reclaim my dignity. The courtroom fell silent, even the judge pausing before responding. David's mask cracked visibly, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting nervously as evidence piled against him, and Stephanie's composure faltered as whispers spread among the spectators. By the time closing arguments ended, the tide was undeniable. The judge dismissed David's defamation claim entirely, citing lack of evidence and the weight of truth in Margaret's account, while allowing Margaret's countersuit for financial exploitation to proceed to trial, a devastating blow to David's credibility. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Margaret, leaning on Susan's arm, faced reporters briefly, saying only, no one should fear their own family. If my story can help one person find their voice, then all of this pain has meaning. That night, exhausted but unbroken, she sat in her condo staring out at the lights of Boston, whispering to herself, I never thought I'd see the day I stood up to my own son in court, but I did, and I survived. But she knew the battle was not over. David still had resources, connections, and the ruthlessness of a man cornered. And though victory seemed closer than ever, the war for her freedom and dignity had only just begun. The weeks after the court hearing felt like living in the eye of a storm, calm on the surface, but heavy with the sense that chaos still brewed just beyond reach. And Margaret tried to keep her focus on the Second Wind Fund, pouring her energy into helping new women arrive at the Somerville house, listening to their stories late into the night over cups of chamomile tea. Stories of daughters who drained their mothers' accounts, of nephews who seized houses with forged deeds, of sons who convinced their aging parents to sign documents they couldn't read. And each testimony fueled her conviction that she had been right to speak out, that silence only fed abusers like David. Yet David himself was unraveling in ways she had never imagined, as whispers from Hartford reached her through old neighbors and even former colleagues of his, revealing that his law firm had quietly placed him on leave, worried about the scandal tainting their brand. And clients began withdrawing cases, fearful of entrusting their reputations to a man accused of exploiting his own mother. While Stephanie, once proud to flaunt her status as a lawyer's wife, began to pull away, spotted alone at country clubs and fundraisers, whispering to friends that she never wanted things to go this far, and hinting that David had pressured her into cutting Margaret off. Susan smirked bitterly when she heard this. The rats always jump ship when the water rises. But Margaret felt only a hollow ache, remembering the warmth Stephanie had once shown her before greed poisoned everything. The breaking point came one humid August evening when Stephanie herself appeared at Margaret's condo, standing nervously at the door in casual clothes instead of her usual polished armor, clutching a folder and speaking quickly. "Please, just hear me out. David is going to destroy himself and he'll take me and the girls down with him if I don't do something. I can't live like this anymore." Margaret hesitated, torn between suspicion and the faintest flicker of hope that someone inside that household still had a shred of conscience. And finally, she let her in. Over tea at the kitchen table, Stephanie confessed in halting tones that she had copies of documents David had forged in Margaret's name, that she had saved them as leverage in case he ever turned on her, and now she was willing to hand them over in exchange for protection from legal fallout. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the papers, her own signature crudely imitated on withdrawal authorizations, power of attorney forms, even a deed transfer that, thankfully, had never been filed. And tears stung her eyes, not from shock, but from confirmation, proof of the betrayal she had always felt in her bones. Susan, when she arrived minutes later and found Stephanie sitting there, was furious, demanding she leave at once. But Margaret placed a trembling hand on her sister's arm and whispered, "No, Susan, we need this. We need her to tell the truth." That night, Stephanie recorded a sworn statement detailing David's manipulations, his verbal abuse, his instructions to forge Margaret's name. And though Margaret despised her daughter-in-law for standing silent while she suffered, she also recognized the strange bitter symmetry of it, that the same woman who had once sneered as Margaret was cast into the rain now held the key to David's undoing. Within days, Angela Price filed the documents in court, strengthening Margaret's case so thoroughly that even David's allies began to distance themselves. And the press caught wind of the betrayal, headlines splashing across Boston and Hartford newspapers. "Attorney accused of defrauding own mother. Wife turns witness." Calls flooded the Second Wind Fund from national organizations, TV programs, even a morning talk show that wanted Margaret to share her story. Though the attention overwhelmed her, she agreed, sitting under bright studio lights as cameras rolled, her voice steady as she declared, "This isn't just about me. This is about the thousands of parents and grandparents who are betrayed by the very children they raised. We need to shine a light on it. We need to protect them." The response was electric. The foundation's donations tripled in a month. Volunteers signed up in droves, and women wrote letters from across the country thanking her for giving them courage to leave abusive households or report financial exploitation. Yet beneath the triumph, Margaret's heart remained heavy. She had always dreamed of her twilight years surrounded by family, her grandchildren visiting on weekends, laughter filling her kitchen. But instead, she was preparing for another court battle that could send her only son spiraling into ruin. Late at night, she sat by her window overlooking the park, clutching her rosary beads, whispering prayers not for victory, but for clarity, for the strength to endure the cost of justice. On one such night, Susan found her awake and asked softly, "Do you regret it, Maggie? Do you wish you'd stayed silent?" Margaret shook her head slowly, tears glistening in her tired eyes. "No. I regret trusting him blindly, but I don't regret fighting back. Silence would have killed me faster than the cold under that bridge." Outside, the city hummed with restless energy, and Margaret realized she was no longer just a mother abandoned by her son. She had become a symbol, a reluctant warrior in a battle too many were losing. And though the weight of that role sometimes threatened to crush her, she also knew it gave her the purpose she had been searching for since the night she was cast into the storm. The final reckoning came sooner than anyone expected, when the state bar announced formal disciplinary hearings against David, citing fraudulent conduct against a vulnerable adult, forgery, and perjury in court filings. Language so damning it left little doubt about the outcome, and though Margaret told herself she would not attend, on the morning of the hearing she found her feet carrying her into the oak-paneled chamber in downtown Hartford, Susan at her side, her heart pounding as she saw her son seated across the room, pale, hollow-eyed, his once immaculate suit rumpled, his gaze darting nervously at the cluster of reporters waiting outside. Stephanie was present too, accompanied by her own attorney, and when their eyes met, Margaret caught an expression she had never expected, something like relief, as if Stephanie were finally unshackled from years of manipulation. The proceedings moved swiftly, with Angela Price presenting the forged documents, the testimony of handwriting experts, and Stephanie's sworn statement, each piece slamming into David like a hammer against glass. He tried to object, to charm the panel with his lawyerly rhetoric, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. And when one of the justices asked, "Mr. Martinez, can you explain why your mother's signature appears on withdrawal slips made while she was hospitalized for pneumonia, documented as incapacitated at the time?" David stammered and fell silent, his mask slipping for all to see. Margaret sat straighter, her voice steady when she was called to speak, recounting how she had been thrown into the storm with nothing but a suitcase and $200, how the son she had raised on 3 jobs had become the man who sought to strip her of everything. And when she finished, the room was silent except for the scratching of pens. The panel recessed for only 20 minutes before announcing their decision. David's license was revoked permanently, and his case was being referred to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. The words landed like a final gavel strike in Margaret's heart. She should have felt triumph, but all she felt was a grief so sharp it stole her breath. Grief for the boy she once cradled, for the man who could not see love without twisting it into power. That night, back in Somerville, she walked alone in the small park near her condo, the summer air heavy with honeysuckle, thinking of Antonio, of the life they had dreamed of. And she whispered into the darkness, "I tried, Tony. God knows I tried." Yet, when she returned home, she found a letter slipped under her door. Stephanie's handwriting shaky but clear. "Margaret, I am sorry beyond words. I know nothing I do can erase the night we cast you out, but please believe me when I say I will not let the girls grow up blind to what their father has done. They will know your strength, your dignity, and that you loved them always. If you can, let me bring them to see you, on your terms, in your home. No secrets, no conditions." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, tears spilling freely, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that the bond with her grandchildren might yet be salvaged. Over the next weeks, as David's legal troubles deepened, Margaret threw herself into launching the Second Wind Fund's headquarters, cutting the ribbon on a converted Victorian in downtown Boston that would serve as shelter, legal aid office, and community center all in one. The event drew local officials, journalists, and dozens of women who had once been silent victims, now standing proud in solidarity. Margaret, dressed simply in a navy suit and her mother's old rosary tucked discreetly in her pocket, gave a speech that would later be quoted in national papers. "I am 72 years old. I have been abandoned, robbed, humiliated. But I am still here. And let me tell you, being old does not mean being powerless. We are not burdens. We are not disposable. We are the roots of our families, the keepers of history, the builders of futures, and we will not be silenced." The applause was thunderous, cameras flashing as she raised her hand in quiet defiance. And in that moment, Margaret felt something she had not felt in years, a certainty that her life still carried meaning, not just for herself, but for countless others. Weeks turned into months, and though David's fate hung uncertain, whispers of a plea deal, of potential prison time, Margaret no longer measured her days by what he might or might not do. Instead, she measured them by the lives touched by the foundation. The widowed teacher who found legal help to reclaim her stolen pension, the retired nurse reunited with her home after being swindled by a nephew, the dozens of seniors who now had a safe place to sleep, to learn, to laugh. On a crisp October afternoon, she sat in the sun-dappled garden of the center, her grandchildren playing nearby under Stephanie's watchful eye, and for the first time since that stormy night in Hartford, when her life had shattered, Margaret allowed herself a smile that was not tinged with sorrow. Susan leaned over and whispered, "You see, Maggie, you didn't just survive, you built something that will outlive us all." And Margaret, watching the children's laughter rise into the golden air, knew her sister was right. She had turned her pain into power, her betrayal into a beacon. And those scars remained. They were no longer symbols of defeat, but of a battle fought and won.